Good afternoon. It is 1:01 and I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is a public meeting of council being held under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended. The purpose of the meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the development charges background study and proposed bylaw dated July 16th, 2024. Council will not be taking any action this afternoon on this background study or the bylaw. Prior to receiving the public comments, we will ask our consultant, Watson and Associates Economists Limited, to do a brief presentation of the findings of the study. Oh, you're here in person. I'm sorry. Okay, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here in person. Much better than virtual whenever we can do so. And so, as you mentioned, we'll be providing a brief presentation today. My name is Daryl Abs. I'm a managing partner with Watson Associates Economists. I'm joined here with my colleague Navreet Bains, senior project coordinator with Watson, and we'll be jointly providing the presentation today, and then happy to answer any questions at the end. Next slide, please. And so the general format for the public meeting, so we had the opening remarks. We'll talk a little bit about why we have to undertake this public meeting. We'll talk a bit about the study process that we've undertaken and the timelines for the study. We'll provide a brief overview of development charges, provide a presentation or a summary of the calculations and the proposed policies and charges that are set out in the background study. Then we're happy to answer any questions from the public, from council, and then we can formally conclude the public meeting. Next slide, please. And so the public meeting is a requirement of the Development Charges Act. And the Development Charges Act is what guides the requirements for us to impose the development charges bylaw. And so this public meeting is to provide council and the public the ability to pose questions about the information that's set out in the background study. The background study is posted on the county's website. It is a couple hundred pages long, so it's always nice to have this brief presentation to summarize the information in that study. There's a requirement to have the study posted to the county's website at least 60 days before council passes the bylaw. And I'll show you on the next slide how we've met that timeline. Next slide, please. And so we started the process back in February, working with staff to prepare the information. And I just want to thank staff for their hard work in assisting us in putting the information together to prepare the background study. We were able to release the background study to the public by putting it on the county's website on May 13th. We're holding this formal public meeting on the 26th, and then council will consider the bylaw on July 16th. At least that's the anticipated date. Next slide, please. And next slide.
So just to give a quick overview of what development charges are. So they're really a tool used by municipalities to recover the capital costs associated with both residential and non-residential growth. And these capital costs are in addition to those costs that a developer would normally be required to construct as part of a subdivision. So those more localized works such as internal roads, sewers, water mains, sidewalks, streetlights. These costs are over and above those more localized works. Municipalities are empowered to impose these charges through the Development Charges Act, and we'll touch on some more details of the legislation in a couple slides. And development charges are typically calculated and imposed at the time of issuance of a building permit. Next slide, please. So this is really a diagram depicting the relationship between the needs to service growth versus the funding of those needs. So with new development comes the need to service that growth with new infrastructure, such as roads, water, wastewater treatment, new libraries, etc. And municipalities can really fund these costs through either development charges, where a developer is ultimately responsible for those costs, and really follows the principle of growth paying for growth. If development charges aren't utilized by a municipality, then those costs fall onto existing residents and businesses. So those will need to be funded through rates, taxes, existing reserves, et cetera. Next slide, please. So the Development Charges Act is very prescriptive in how the DC is calculated. And this slide just really provides our methodology in calculating the charge. This is all detailed within our background study, but just at a very high level. The first thing we do is identify the amount, type, and location of growth. Once we identify that, which is usually done through an official plan or some other type of planning document, we then identify the servicing needs to accommodate that growth. From those servicing needs, we identify the capital costs, to provide the services to meet the needs. And then from there, we have what we call gross capital costs. From there, we need to make a number of deductions. If you look under 4.1, there's the grant subsidies and other contributions. Those are usually pretty few and far in between these days, but if there is a grant anticipated for a project, we do need to make the associated deduction. And then the second deduction is benefit to existing development. A good example of this would be widening an existing road, which could be required both for alleviating an existing traffic or congestion issue, but also to accommodate a new development. So in this case, we would need to make a deduction for the costs related to alleviating those traffic issues. And then the net costs related to accommodating the new development would go into the development charge. We then need to make a further deduction, if necessary, for the historical service standard calculation. So the Development Charges Act requires us to do this calculation, which looks at the level of service that was provided over the past 15 years. And that upper limit cannot be exceeded when imposing a DC. So if that limit is exceeded, then we must make a deduction. And then the last deduction is not really applicable to the county since it's the first DC bylaw, but if there are existing DC reserve funds, we typically make an adjustment for those as well. Once we make all those deductions, we then arrive at the net costs, which are then allocated between residential and non-residential benefits. And then we then divide that by the associated growth to calculate the DC. Next slide, please. So just to summarize all of that and kind of bring it all together into a simple diagram, the DC calculation is essentially taking the numerator, which is the cost of infrastructure required to accommodate growth, divided by the denominator, which is the residential and non-residential growth. When you divide those two together, we arrive at the development charge. And then for residential growth, this is a development charge per unit. So it varies by single detached, townhouse, and apartments. And then for non-res, it's a development charge per square foot or per square meter of gross floor area. And we'll go into what those charges are in a couple slides. Next slide, please. So the DCA prescribes the eligible services that can be collected for. And there's 19 services that are DC eligible. So as part of the county's DC study, we're considering services related to a highway right now. So that includes any our road network, sidewalks, streetlights, active transportation, as well as public works. So any of the operations yards, vehicles and equipment. So that's all being considered as part of the DC. In addition, there's also growth studies, which is not on this list, but it can be included as a class of service, which comprises these services. So things like master plans, official plans, the DC study, those are all can be considered as part of the DC, and they have been included in the DC. Next slide, please. And again.
Okay, so a brief history on development charges. Development charges aren't new. They've actually been around since the 1950s, and they were called lot levies and imposed under the Planning Act. There's been a number of changes to the legislation over the last few years. And in the next few slides, I'll do my best to weave through a lot of the changes that have occurred and try to make sense of those. Next slide, please. And so just taking the most important points of the changes over the last few years, starting with Bill 108. So Navreet mentioned earlier on in the presentation that development charges are typically collected at the time of building permit issuance. However, there are some nuances to that. And so if you are rental housing or institutional development, you get to pay your development charge in installments. And so it's 6 equal annual installments. The first installment on the date of occupancy, and then each year, every year thereafter. As well, there's this development charge rate freeze. And so if I proceed through application of site plan or zoning bylaw amendment with my development charge rate is frozen on the date I submit my application. The municipalities will go through and approve those applications. Once those applications are approved, I then have 2 years to pull my building permit before I'm charged the new rate. So if I pull it within those 2 years, my rate is frozen at the rate when I submitted my application. Otherwise, I pay the rate of the day. Now, there's some recent legislative changes which have shortened that time frame, and I'll talk about that in a couple slides. Bill 197 brought in a kind of a sweeping legislative change, and a number of acts were amended. But with respect to development charges, it removed this mandatory 10% deduction we had to do. It actually listed out those eligible services that Navreet went through, those 19 services, listed those in the act, and as well brought in this new revenue tool for municipalities called the community benefit charge legislation. It's not eligible for the upper tier municipalities to include, so we haven't considered that at all as part of this. Bill 213 brought in an exemption for universities, and Bill 109 brought in some reporting requirements for the treasurers. Next slide, please. So Bill 23, I'm sure most people are familiar with this bill. It got a lot of press for a lot of the changes that it was making. And it really did bring in a lot of exemptions, reductions, to what municipalities could recover through development charges. And so it brought in, if you have an inclusionary zoning bylaw that requires affordable housing units to be constructed, those affordable housing units are exempt. Nonprofit housing is exempt. ARUs, so additional residential units, you can add up to 2 apartments in a single detached, semi-detached, or a townhouse, and you don't have to pay development charges on those additional apartments. Now that can be 2 apartments in the house. So let's say 2 basement apartments, or 1 basement apartment, 1 ancillary apartment on top of a garage, as an example. There's a discount for rental housing. So not only do they get to pay in 6 equal annual installments, there's also a discount based on the bedroom size. And then housing services used to be eligible for inclusion in development charges. Unfortunately, that has been removed. They made some changes to the definition of capital cost to remove studies, but most recently with the recent legislative changes, they've added that studies back in as being eligible. So we've included that in our analysis. They brought in a mandatory phase-in, but that again has been removed as part of the recent legislative changes. So a lot of changes and kind of a little bit of flip-flopping here. So what we've done as part of the background study is made sure that we have the most up-to-date information that meets the legislative requirements. There's some other matters with respect to a maximum interest rate you can impose on the installment payments and the rate freeze, the requirement to allocate 60% of the monies in a reserve fund to specific projects for services related to a highway in your example. And then as well, the development charge bylaw used to have a life of 5 years. That has now been extended to 10 years. Next slide, please. So they brought in the province brought in an exemption for affordable housing. And this is something that municipalities across the province are trying to grapple with right now. And essentially what it says is if for affordable rental units and affordable owned units, they want to make sure that people aren't spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And so what the province has done is they've put out a bulletin, and that bulletin gives a specific price in each municipality at what that threshold is. So how we can define or deem these units as affordable. Municipalities have to enter into agreements with the developer or the builder to ensure that these units remain affordable for a period of 25 years. So I know this is going to require the county to work with the local municipalities to determine how the county can be party to those agreements and work together to ensure that we're meeting that requirement of the legislation. Finally, in April, this legislation was introduced, and on June 6th, it took effect. And what they've done is they've removed the mandatory phase-in that was brought in with Bill 23. They've added studies as being eligible, again, changing back from what Bill 23 removed. They've reduced this DC rate freeze time period from 2 years to 18 months. And then as well, they've implemented a process for minor amendments to allow municipalities who have already passed their bylaw to align with the legislation. So that won't apply to the county because we haven't passed the bylaw yet. But it is noted there for the local municipalities. The last bullet there, modernizing public notice requirements, is actually not enforced yet. It is a change to the regulation that we're anticipating coming soon. But essentially for municipalities that don't have a newspaper of record, instead of posting or providing notice through a local newspaper nearby, they could just post their notice requirements on the municipal website. Okay, so that's not yet in force, but something we're monitoring. And next slide, please.
And next slide. So as Daryl mentioned, there's a number of mandatory DC exemptions and discounts that municipalities must provide for. So there's the upper and lower tier governments and school boards. If a developer's expanding an industrial building by up to 50%, there's no DC applicable. Development of lands intended for use by a university. When it comes to intensification of existing or new homes, you can add up to 2 apartments in a detached, semi-detached, or row house. On the rental side, you can add 1 additional unit or 1% of existing units in an existing building without DCs. And then there's these more recent exemptions that just came into place. So affordable inclusionary zoning units, the nonprofit housing, the discount for rental housing, which is based on the number of bedrooms. So you're looking at anywhere from a 15 to 25% discount based on those bedrooms. And of course, the affordable rental and owned units. There's also the attainable units exemption, but that's not yet in force. Next slide, please. So in addition to those mandatory exemptions, there's also discretionary exemptions that municipalities can provide for within their bylaws. And you can reduce in part or whole the DC for either a type of development, so something like a church or a place of worship, or an entire class of development. So industrial development can be exempt. So if you look in that box at the bottom, the proposed discretionary exemptions within the county's bylaw are industrial development, agricultural uses, and places of worship. There's also redevelopment credits that can be utilized for recognizing a site that has an existing development. So an example would be is if a single family detached dwelling is torn down and replaced with, say, a townhouse complex, the developer would receive a credit to recognize that there was an existing home on that site. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, DCs are imposed for infrastructure in addition to those more localized works a developer is responsible for constructing. So there's something we call a local service policy we include in our background studies, and that can be found in Appendix E of the study. And this really sets out what's included in the DC versus what's required by the developers as part of their development agreements. And this has become much more important in recent years with the addition of the no additional levies clause within the Act, which really prohibits municipalities from imposing additional payments or requiring construction of a service that's not authorized under the DC Act. So within the county's local service policy, we've considered and included components related to county roads, intersection improvements, traffic control systems, active transportation, land acquisition, etc. Next slide, please.
And next slide. So with respect to the development charge calculation, we talked about needing to identify the anticipated growth and development. And so chapter 3 of our background study, as well as appendix A, provides detailed analysis on the anticipated growth. And so what we're looking at is growing by just over 13,000 people, just under 7,300 residential units, and just under 3.55 million square feet of non-residential building space. Next slide, please. So with respect to the calculated rates, what we're looking at is for a single detached home for services related to a highway, so the roads and public works, it's $5,462 per unit. And the charge for growth related studies would be $22 per unit for a total of $5,484 per unit. You'll see we have the residential categories of charges for other multiples, which is your townhomes, your apartments that have 2 bedrooms or more, your apartments that are a studio or 1 bedroom, and then the special care, special dwelling units, which reflect, let's say, retirement homes or long-term care homes. And you can see the charges are reduced for each of those units as they are reflective of less people in those units. On the non-residential side, the total charge we're looking at is $3.65 per square foot. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do with the next couple of slides is show the lower tier municipalities, DC charges, and then what they look like with the proposed county development charges on top. And so you can see in the blue color, we have and the green color together combined create the lower tier charge. And then the yellow box on the top is the upper tier charge. So you can see for our Thames Center on the far left, their charges would go from just under $50,000 to just over $50,000 for a single detached unit. Middlesex Center's proposed charges in total would be just over $40,000, similar to Luke and Vidal's charge. Strathroy Caradoc, kind of in the middle 36,000 area. And then you have North Middlesex and Adelaide Metcalfe. Noting on the far right, we have Southwest Middlesex and Newbury. Southwest Middlesex is currently undertaking a development charge background study and reviewing potentially including charges. So that may change in the near future. Next slide, please. With respect to commercial development charges, very similar. You can see on the far left, we have Thames Center. And so these charges would put them at just over $20 per square foot. For commercial developments, Middlesex Center and Strathroy, just over $15 per square foot. And then the rest of the survey, as you see to the right. Next slide, please. With respect to industrial development charges, the main difference here is we're proposing to exempt industrial development charges or industrial development from these charges. So there is no proposed county charge. The one nuance here with the lower tiers is North Middlesex actually has a differing charge for wastewater for large industrial users. So you can see on the far left, they have a higher charge, about $20 per square foot for those large industrial users. And then the survey is very similar to the commercial survey. Next slide, please. So as well, we wanted to compare to some other counties in their development charges. And so we've also included London on the far left, and the light blue color shows the roads component, services related to a highway component of the charge and how they compare across the other counties. So you can see Simcoe County has a charge with the roads component of the charge being just over $10,000. Peterborough County just over $12,000. You got Wellington County and Grey County in the range of $7,600. And then we have our calculated charge of $5,462 for the roads component you'll see there. And Bruce County on the far right. Now we'll note Bruce County just implemented their first development charge last year, and they've actually phased in their rate over 10 years. So the calculated charge is very similar to the calculated charge we've identified for Middlesex County. Next slide, please. And next slide.
So next steps in the DC process is to, in July 16th, 2024, we will be back to for council consideration of the draft bylaw. Next slide, please. And that concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Next up, we're going to have comments from the public. We'll open the floor to comments. Please limit your remarks to 5 minutes. When you are speaking, please provide your name, business association, and address for the record. No one there? Okay. Okay. So last call, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. I would. Mr. Wilsey, the floor is yours if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, just a question on these. With it being voted in July, I guess, sorry, Councillor from Strathroy Caradoc. If it's going to be voted in July, when would it come effect for new builds? Would it be immediately in effect, or would it be in the next year, or when would we start having to look at collecting these development charges?
Through you, Madam Warden, if I may, we've heard feedback already from our local municipalities, and obviously we're taking feedback today. So the draft bylaw as proposed is considered for implementation in July. However, staff will review all the feedback and may come back to council with an alternative implementation date, even though a possible recommendation for approval of the bylaw may come forward. So that is not yet determined.
Do you have any further comments? If there's no one else, then we can move on to closing the meeting. We want to thank the members of the public for their comments. The deadline for the receipt of written responses is July 8th, 2024. Council will be considering the bylaw at its July 16th, 2024 council meeting. To submit comments or for additional information, please do not hesitate to contact our county clerk at clerk@middlesex.ca. And with that, then we have a motion before us that the meeting adjourn at 1:28 p.m. If I could have a mover, please, and a seconder. Councillor Burkhart-Jessen and Councillor Smybert, thank you very much. All in favor? Okay. Thank you very much.